Okay. Welcome back to my channel. Today we are going to be doing some revision, and we are going to be focusing on economic activities. All right. So the first question says differentiate between renewable and non-renewable resources. And that's for 2 marks. All right, so this is a very straightforward question. Renewable resource refers to resources that after we use them, they can be replenished by nature within our lifetime. So we will have them to use again. Those include forest and fish. So if we cut down a tree, it is possible for the tree to grow back. Some trees, of course, will take a longer time than some other trees. Fish, again, when we, because fish is a type of animal, and just like an animal, the fish is able to reproduce. So the fact that it is able to reproduce, it is being replenished. Non-renewable resources are those resources that when they are depleted, they will not be replenished by nature within our lifetime. So we can say that those resources are exhausted or they are used up. Most of the resources that come under this category are mineral resources, such as bauxite, oil, and natural gas, etc. All right. Number 2 says define each of the following: primary industry, tertiary industry. Again, a straightforward question. Define means that they are just asking for the meanings of the terms. You don't have to go into a lot of details. You don't have to go into an explanation. You don't have to elaborate. All you are doing is giving the meaning. So for primary industry, we can define primary industry as an industry in which raw materials are extracted or harvested from the natural environment. All right. So examples of primary industries include mining, where minerals are being extracted from the ground, or even forestry, where trees are being extracted from the forest. But of course, you don't need to get into the examples just because they are just asking you for the definition. Tertiary economic activity is an economic activity in which services are provided both to people as well as to other industries. All right, number 3 says, with reference to specific examples, explain 3 economic benefits of primary activities in the Caribbean, and that's for 12 marks. So 12 marks, you don't want to lose any of those 12 marks. So when you see a question like this, you will now need to plan your answer. All right? And planning your answer doesn't have to take a long time. All right? So you notice it's 12 marks and they're asking you for 3 benefits. All right? So you can consider in your mind already that each of those benefits, 4 marks would be allotted to each of those benefits. All right. So perhaps the examiner will give you 1 mark for listing the benefit, and then another 3 marks for explaining why that factor is a benefit. All right. So I've listed 3 benefits, 3 economic benefits right here. So I have employment, foreign exchange, GDP. Notice the question also asks for specific examples. So those examples might be examples of the primary economic activities. All right. So if we're talking about employment, and when you are writing your answers, you want to make it as easy as possible for the examiner to go through and find the answers. So what you could do, you could start with these subheadings. So you could start with employment. So you write employment, and then you say what it is that you have to say about employment. You write foreign exchange, say what it is that you have to say about foreign exchange, and then you write GDP. So you want to organize how you answer your questions. So let's say we're talking about employment and we want to give an example. So we could talk about agriculture, for example. So we could make the point that agriculture provides both self-employment for farmers as well as paid employment. So where a person is working for another person. And then if we want to get into why this is a benefit, we could explain that when more persons are employed, it gives those persons uh, a greater level of independence, and it increases their standard of living. Another thing you could say if you're developing that point about employment, you could explain that the more persons are employed within a country, the more spending that will take place. And spending is like the fuel of an economy. It causes an economy to be healthier. All right. So you could develop on the point of employment by explaining why employment uh, provides benefits. All right. If you're talking about agriculture also on that same point of employment, you could explain that since agriculture mainly occurs in rural communities, the the more rural residents are employed through agriculture, the greater is the chance for the rural area to be developed. All right. In terms of foreign exchange, you could explain that foreign exchange can be gained by Caribbean countries when they export their goods abroad. And you could give an example. So you could say, for example, in the fishing industry, certain seafoods are exported. For example, lobster is exported from Belize, and that causes the country to earn foreign exchange. And with that foreign exchange, the country is able to participate in international trade, which in turn is important because the countries of the Caribbean are not self-sufficient. So some of the things that they need, they don't have locally. And so they need to obtain these things from abroad, which they will need the foreign exchange in order to purchase. All right? So that's how you would develop on your point. You are explaining, you are giving reasons for what you are saying. And so the third thing you could talk about GDP, which is a gross domestic product, or uh, it is the total money value of all the goods and services that are produced by a country within a year. All right. So if you state GDP, you might be able to get a mark for that. And maybe if you give the definition of GDP, you might be able to get another mark. Remember, you're trying to get 4 marks here. And then now you could explain why GDP is important. All right. So GDP is an indicator of economic development. And so the greater is a country's GDP, the more developed the country might be, and the more developed it is, the greater foreign investment we might have in the country. Also, the when the GDP increases, it might also increase the standard of living for the citizens within a country. All right. So those are some of the things that you could talk about if you are responding to this particular question. Of course, it's not set in stone, so there are different things that you could say, but that is just one way that you could answer this question. All right. So the next question says define the term secondary economic activity. All right, and that's for 2 marks. So again, we're just giving the meaning of the term. So secondary economic activity or secondary industry is the industry in which raw materials are converted to a finished product, simply put. And the second part of the question is asking for examples of economic activities. 2 examples. Again, you just need to state the examples, no details necessary. So examples would include garment industry, food processing industry, oil refining, etc. All right. You could also give construction industry. That's another type of secondary economic activities. So most of the others that I gave were manufacturing industries, but you could also include construction industry. All right. Number 6 says state 3 ways by which a country can benefit from the development of secondary industries. All right. So this is similar to the question that we answered before on primary economic activities and the benefits that they provide. So again, secondary industries will provide employment. And notice for this, it's 3 marks, so you wouldn't have to get into the details. So it provides employment. It contributes to the gross domestic product. It increases foreign exchange. It helps to improve the standard of living of the citizens in the country. Because Secondary industry uses raw material that is produced at the primary level. The secondary industry acts as a market for the primary industry. Secondary industries also help to satisfy the needs and wants of people. For example, the food processing industry helps to provide food for persons in the country. All right, so any of those three that you clearly list or clearly state will help you to earn the 3 marks. Question 7 says, explain why Caribbean governments are giving increasing attention to the development of tertiary economic activities. And it says include 2 reasons in your answer. Now this is for 4 marks. So even though it's an explanation, we don't have to go too deep. All right. So tertiary economic activities, remember, are activities in which service is being provided. So what are some of the reasons the government might be giving more attention to tertiary economic activities than maybe in the past? Uh, this industry is providing service and not so much goods. I say not so much goods because in the restaurant business it's a service industry, but some amount of processing because you're cooking meals. So that industry now kind of even though it's deemed service industry because the main emphasis is on the service that is being provided, it does involve some amount of goods. All right, but for most other industries, the main resource that is being used is not so much physical resource but human resources. Now that is important because a lot of our raw materials or our natural resources are now being depleted. A lot of Caribbean governments now find it necessary to concentrate on that industry where human resource is one of the most important types of resources. All right. Uh, because again, it is service and not so much goods based. It is not as tied to the land as uh, primary and secondary industries are tied to the land. Primary industries are tied to the land because you're extracting raw materials from the environment. Secondary industries are tied to the land because you need to set up a factory to convert your raw material into a finished product. But when it comes on to tertiary economic activities where you're providing service, you are it's flexible. People can be doing a lot of jobs, a lot of work by even working from home. You don't have to be at one particular place. You can be doing your work while traveling from one place to another. So there's a greater level of flexibility. Again, we could say that it is tied to people's talents and gifts. Ideas become very important in this type of industry, and uh, you know, ideas ideas can be there are so many ideas that can be generated even within a day. So it is not as limited as a physical resources. Another reason is that tertiary industry, as I said before, is not only service to people, it's service to other industries. So when service is provided to other industries, to primary industries, to secondary industries, it makes it improves the quality of the goods that are produced by these other industries. Service industries include industries that help to distribute goods and services. Sorry, well, to distribute goods. All right. So marketing is a type of service, and so that is important both for the primary industry as well as for the secondary industry. So for these reasons and for many others, Caribbean governments might be giving more attention to the tertiary industries than they did in the past. All right. Number 8 says explain two challenges faced by the fishing industry in a named Caribbean country. All right. That's 6 marks. Two challenges, 6 marks. Maybe the distribution of the marks might be 3 marks for each of the challenges that you choose to talk about. All right. So maybe by listing the challenge, you might get 1 mark, and then for saying something else about it, you might get the other 2 marks. So some of the challenges faced by the fishing industry, and maybe you could get another mark for stating the Caribbean territory. All right. So we could choose Belize, for example, and we could talk about challenges such as hazards that are associated with the sea. So, for example, um, sharks could attack fishermen. Then we have storm surges and other hazards that are associated with the sea that can cause fishermen to die or put them at uh, a lot of risk. Then we have overfishing, where uh, too many fish are being caught, and among the fish that are being caught are young fish that do not get a chance to grow to maturity so that they can reproduce. This can bring about extinction of certain species of fish. So that might be a problem. All right. Then we have destruction of coral reefs. Certain fishing methods can actually destroy coral reefs, and we know that coral reefs are uh, marine habitats. So when coral reefs are destroyed, you're actually destroying the habitats for certain marine life. When coral reefs are destroyed by certain fishing methods, again, it's going to affect the coastal areas because we know that coral reefs help to protect the coast from harmful and very strong waves. Another challenge is that uh, the waters might become polluted. It can become polluted as a result of fishing activities, but it can also become polluted by other activities. For example, agriculture, urbanization. Those things can cause pollution of the water, and when pollution takes place, remember that that can affect the fish, and then it can in turn, depending on the type of pollutant we are talking about, it can in turn affect those who eat the fish, because now we are connected to that food chain that begins in the marine environment. So you could talk about any two of those challenges. So remember the main thing you need, they ask you for a named Caribbean country, you need to state a Caribbean country that you would have studied. And you need to give, clearly state two challenges, and then you need to develop on those two challenges. Explain why it is that you consider them to be challenges. All right, so here's another question similar to the previous one. It says, explain two challenges facing tourism in the Caribbean. And we are familiar with one of the main challenges going on right now, which is the pandemic, which has caused, it has affected the tourism industry in so many different ways. Uh, it has lowered the the number of visitors. It has caused a lot of persons to actually lose their jobs, and it has caused the the workers to have to do things differently, and sometimes the changes are more tedious, more difficult, even though because of the problem they might be doing more work for less pay. All right, so that's one challenge that is current and that we can relate to. Hazards is another challenge. All right, when we have things like hurricanes, volcanic eruptions, even earthquakes in the Caribbean, these can have a serious impact on the tourism industry. Again, during the hurricane season, you might have less persons visiting the country, the different territories. Certain attractions may become destroyed as a result of natural hazards, and then that in turn is going to have an impact. And then because the tourism industry is also connected to other industries like the agricultural industry, the fishing industry, when these hazards impact these industries, then the tourism industry will in turn be impacted. Right? Again, something similar is environmental degradation based on some of the activities that we carry on with. Uh, or we might be destroying our natural environment. And remember, our natural environment is a part of what attracts tourists to our country. All right. So you could talk about any of those things. You could also talk about tourist harassment and how that negatively impacts the tourist industry. All right, let's continue. Number 10, explain two factors influencing the location of fishing industry in a named Caribbean country. Again, I would stick to Belize. I think Belize is a good example, good case study when it comes on to fishing. It's 6 marks for two factors, which means that you might get 1 mark for a particular factor and 2 more marks for developing on those factors, explaining those factors. All right, so if you talk about raw material, remember that the raw material itself is the marine life, right? the seafood itself, and that the marine life, the fish, for example, is tied to the fishing grounds. So Belize, for example, is able to have a well-developed fishing industry because it has an extensive area of continental shelf compared to other Caribbean territories that have only small areas of continental shelf. It has the second largest barrier reef, which is also a marine habitat. It has some atoll reefs that are also marine habitats. It has mangroves, and it has areas where there are um, large rivers are flowing into the sea and releasing nutrients. So those areas again act as fishing grounds. So with those fishing grounds, it means that fish will be available, and of course it's a primary industry. And so if the raw material itself is necessary in order to have this type of industry. All right, now another factor that you could talk about is market. All right, and you could talk about the fact that where Belize is located, it is relatively close to the main markets in the USA, for example, or and Europe, uh, because the Caribbean is centrally located. You could even talk about the cooperatives and the role that they play in helping to develop the good marketing strategies to ensure that the fishermen are able to get paid when they sell their catch. All right. All right. So next question. Describe two factors which have influenced the location of oil and natural gas industry in the Caribbean. All right. So the best example to use for this is Trinidad and Tobago. We could talk about raw material. We could talk about labor. We could talk about government. We could talk about transportation. So we could talk about any of those factors and how they influence the location of the industry. All right. So raw material, very important. Trinidad and Tobago has both oil and natural gas. Uh, the natural gas is found offshore. The oil is found on land and offshore. And even though the oil is being depleted now, they still have uh, natural gas, and they are still exploring to find other areas that oil might exist. All right. So the fact that oil and natural gas exist in Trinidad and Tobago makes the industry a successful one in that country. We could talk about labor. This type of industry uh, needs a variety of labor, but a lot of skilled labor is necessary. The advantage that Trinidad and Tobago has is that it has an educated workforce so that labor can easily be provided. In terms of government is generally stable, and because it is stable, then that is going to encourage foreign investors to invest in the industry, all right, in order to bring in needed capital. Transportation, transportation of oil and natural gas takes place both by pipelines and roads, and there are very good networks of both pipelines and roads in Trinidad and Tobago that connects the main areas where uh, the raw materials exist and where the refining exists and where the exporting is taking place. So these areas are well linked by roads and pipelines. You want to explain that. All right, so the final question that we are going to look at says compare two factors influencing the location of food processing industry of Singapore with that of the Caribbean. All right, so again, try to locate where in the syllabus this question might be connected. All right, so it's very important that you know the factors. We've been looking at the factors from the previous questions. So raw material, we could talk about raw material, we could talk about energy, we could talk about market, we could talk about the role of the government, we could talk about transportation, and so on. In terms of raw material, uh, both Caribbean countries as well as Singapore imports raw material. But the difference between the two is that even though the Caribbean imports raw material, they generally have a well-established agricultural sector so that a large amount of the raw materials that are used in the food processing industry still comes from the agricultural sector. For Singapore, most of the raw material that they use in the food processing industry actually comes from abroad. And when it comes down to energy, which is another important factor, this is why I use these two factors. Not that the other factors are not important, but when we think about uh, manufacturing industry, we're talking about conversion of raw materials. So it's important we talk about raw material. And then in order for the conversion to take place, the processing requires energy. So energy is another important factor. All right, so most of the countries in the Caribbean, except just a few, import all of the energy that they use in their food industry from abroad. All right. Uh, Trinidad and Tobago is one of the exceptions. For Singapore, a similar situation exists. We again, just like for the raw material, they have to they import their energy. But we have to make this point very clear. Singapore has a well established oil refining industry. So even though they import the oil, they don't only import oil, they import oil, refine, and then they re export so that more than enough energy is available in Singapore to carry out their food processing. All right. I hope you understand that. So both places, Caribbean countries are importing. Singapore imports as well. But for the Caribbean country, except for places like Trinidad, to a far lesser extent, Barbados, um, most of the other Caribbean countries will be importing all of the energy that it uses, and the only thing they do is to import and use the energy that they are importing. Singapore imports, but they also refine and then they re-export. So there is a well developed oil refining industry in Singapore. And so that also aids in the success of their food processing industry. All right. So that is where I will stop. No, it was a long video, but I hope that it helped you in one way or another. I am going to ask you to like, to share, and to subscribe. I will see you in another video.